2, 3. Aw, darn it. Testing, testing, testing. All right, we can maybe adjust over here. All right, let's see if you can. Yeah, let's see if we can. Yeah, I will keep talking. Set up the channels, install the app. Testing. I'll keep talking here so you can see the levels. Thomas Hale's Hat Factory. It's a fabulous sign. His hat factory was in the old town, Market Square, but it had to move after the 1811 fire up to the north end on High Street. Awesome. It sounds
Actually, I'll sign them before the talks to save you some time. Did you just bring all those? Oh, you just got them. But did you? Did, okay. You buy them from me. Okay. Um, let me test these first. Do you want me to say something yet? Hello, hello. I'm here. No, no. Now you're coming. What? Oh, this thing? Is this thing amplified to the room too? Is that? Okay, I have a pretty loud voice, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Um, sure. Oh, hello, hello, hello. That's. Well, I'm not gonna stand this close, so I'm gonna stand like this. Is that okay? I need to be able to see my screen, but that's okay. That's okay.
Is that okay?
That's
I can always
that's.
put it so
No.
it's above, like over in this area.
Yeah, but then it won't pick me up, will it?
Well, I'll just move it so it can.
Oh.
If that's okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's whatever. Okay. Yeah,
Is that too intrusive for you now?
it's interesting. It's okay, as long as it doesn't fall down.
Yeah, it shouldn't.
And
I don't know.
they go
Their
a little
equipment's-
bit up. Okay, that should be fine. I think I'm just gonna stare at it though. That's fine.
Yeah.
Can you hear? Well,
I think
what do you want me to do?
hear you a lot better.
Okay. Hello? How does that look from out there? Does it look like strange? No? Thanks. Hello? Hello? Okay. Good. Okay, so I sound okay? Good. Okay. Um, so let's do this. So those are free, so it's $90 and I have change, but I take a check. I can't take a credit card. So, and let's see what I'm going to do. Okay. And you tell me who, if anybody, you want me to sign them to. Yes, please. Are you Ruth? Ruth. My mother's Ruth. My mother was Ruth. A lot of Ruths in my family. Oh, wow.
When he comes back, we can do it. That's fine.
Hello, everyone. Gosh, do I ever love a full house? So good to see all of you. Ah, wonderful. My name is Bethany Grofterow. You know, I have to check my notes to make sure I know my own name. I am the executive director here at the Museum of Old Newbury, and it is just a thrill to see you all. And I'm thrilled to welcome you here to hear about Rebels at Sea with my friend Eric J Dolan. Thank you to all of you for attending this program, but I'd like to especially thank those of you who are members, volunteers, and board members, who of course are volunteers here at the museum. There's a cast of thousands that makes this little museum run. If you're not a member, I would invite you to join us at newburyhistory.org. Or I have this piece of paper in my hand that you can fill out, old school. Not getting out of here without a membership ask. We would like to especially thank Bridge Street Scholarship, the Bridge Street, it's going to be a hard one, the Bridge Street Sponsorship Fund of the Mass Humanities for allowing this event to be free for all of you, and also for encouraging us to also live stream it, which is being done by the Greater Newburyport Community Media Hub. So thank you to Mass Humanities, thank you to Community Media for their help with this event. So before we begin, I'd like to let you know about a couple of upcoming events here at the museum. First and foremost, we are open for tours for the first time since 2019, and docents are eagerly awaiting your arrival from 11 to 5, Thursday through Sunday, until the middle of October. And I can't tell you how many times I have run into a friend in this town, and I tell them where I'm working, and they say, oh, I've lived around the corner my whole life, and I've never been in the museum. You have no excuse. We are here 4 days a week waiting for you to come. You can even sign up for a tour online and reserve your spot, so you'll know you have a spot. So please do come take a tour. On Saturday from 2 to 4, we have a program called Midsummer Magic, creating Swedish folk art in the garden, which is a painting event with a Swedish artist. On Sunday, July 3rd, we are, again, thanks to Mass Humanities, presenting Reading Frederick Douglass Together, which we will be doing. We'll be reading a Frederick Douglass speech actually in Brown Square near the statue of Garrison. So please join us there. It's from 10 to 11. Should be a really, in previous years, it's been a really powerful event. We also have cemetery and walking tours coming up over the next month. And hot off the presses, this is an event I am so excited about. Cecilia Bow and Margaret Cushing, a Cape Ann sojourn, is a full-day field trip. We're going to try to do one big field trip once a year that, has me pressing all of my colleagues into service. So we will be starting here looking at a portrait of Margaret Cushing. It was painted by incredible portrait artist Cecilia Bow. Then going to the Cape Ann Museum for a private curator's tour of their Cecilia Bow collection and their general collection. And then we have Beauport, the Sleeper McCann House on Easter Point, all to ourselves. So it's a full-day event. There are only 24 spots, and you have to be a member. So if you would like to come up to that event, become a member, and you can sign up and join us for that day with Cecilia Bow and Margaret Cushing. So excited about that one. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce my dear friend, Eric J Dolan. Eric J Dolan is the author of 15 books. Is that right? Is that true? Wow. And well, I had to update it on the fly because I last read his bio at the Newburyport Literary Festival. Untrue. I have read one more book. There you go. His most recent is Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution, which we'll talk about today. His last book before this one, A Furious Sky, which James likes to call A Furious Guy. This furious guy. The 500-year history of America's hurricanes is a family favorite of ours and received a number of accolades, including being chosen by the Washington Post as one of the 50 notable books of nonfiction in 2020. Other books include Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America, which is my favorite, which was chosen as one of the best nonfiction books in 2007 by the Los Angeles Times and the Boston Globe, and also won the 2007 John Lyman Award for U.S. Maritime History. Black Flag's Blue Waters, The Epic History of America's Most Notorious Pirates, which was chosen as a must-read book for 2019 by the Massachusetts Center for the Book. I'm going to sell you hard. And was a finalist for the 2019 Julia Ward Howe Award given by the Boston Authors Club. That must be a fun group. A graduate of Brown, Yale, and MIT, a wicked smart and wicked nice guy. I give you Eric J. Dolan, who lives in Marblehead with his family. Over to you, Eric.
thank you very much for that introduction. And I have to tell you all, if you don't know Bethany, you are missing something. She is amazing. You are so lucky to have her as an executive director. Not only is she a shining personality, just bubbly, outgoing, bubbly maybe is the word you don't like, but anyway, bubbly, outgoing, but she knows an incredible amount about history, and she's passionate about what she does, and I'm very jealous because I think she's a much better writer than I am. She's really, really good. And she didn't tell you, and I'll tell you, that each one of you gets to take something home from the museum tonight. No? 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 No, wait a second. Are you sure? Okay. No. Okay. Can you you said you're going to turn down the lights a little bit. But anyway, thank you very much for coming. I love Newburyport. I've been up here dozens of times. We live in Marblehead. I often, when I have a day off and I just want to go absorb some history, I come up here and I walk around just beautiful houses, great history, and really a nice place. But anyways, late in the day on June 3rd, 1780, when Salem captain Jonathan Harridan and his privateer Pickering was on their way to the friendly port of Bilbao, Spain. The British privateer Achilles, however, stood in the way. Nobody would have faulted Harridan had he fled in the face of a superior foe. While the Pickering had a crew of 38 and 16 cannons, the Achilles bristled with 135 men and 43 cannons, most of which were larger than Pickering's 6-pounders. It was hardly a fair fight, but that's not how Harridan saw it. He relished the chance to confront the enemy and strike a blow for American independence. Turning to the British prisoner who had informed him of the Achilles' might, he said, "I shan't run from her." And he didn't. As the Achilles began its advance, Harridan told his men that though the Achilles appeared to be superior to them in force, he had no doubt that they should beat her off if they were firm and steady and did not throw away their fire. Meanwhile, in Bilbao, word quickly spread that there was about to be a major battle offshore between the Americans and the British, and about 1,000 people came to the beach to watch the spectacle. Booming broadsides and muskets filled the air. One of Harridan's crew said that while shot flew around him, Harridan was as calm and steady as amidst a shower of snowflakes. The battle raged for more than 2 hours. Then Harridan ordered his men to fill the cannons with bar shot, which is basically 2 cannonballs connected by an iron bar. And once that comes out of the muzzle of a cannon, it starts spinning wildly, destroying rigging, sails, and occasionally masts, as well as sometimes taking people's heads off. Now, these projectiles had a devastating impact on the Achilles. And having had enough, the Achilles turned tail and fled with the rebel commander close behind. But the Achilles was too fast despite its injuries, and Harridan soon spun about to reclaim the Golden Eagle, which was a British ship that earlier the Achilles had taken from Harridan, and now he got her back. All told, one of Pickering's men was killed, his head sheared off by a cannonball, and 8 were wounded. How many people were wounded or died on the British ship is unknown. And I want to tell you a little bit about this plaque. This is the top third of a large plaque that was placed in Salem in 1909 by the Sons of the American Revolution. I read about it while working on the book, and the book that I read said that it was on the side of a house right near the Witch Museum in Salem. So I hopped on my bike, I rode to Salem, and I looked at every single house in that intersection, and I couldn't find it. So I called a local historian, and I said, "What happened to the plaque?" And she started laughing. She goes, "Well, it's inside of the Korean restaurant, the barbecue restaurant, the Bon Shan, right next to Jerry's Army Navy." She had no idea why it ended up there. So this is during COVID, so I walked into the restaurant. They were very excited to see me, thinking that I was going to order some food, which I didn't. I said, "No, I'm here for that thing behind your head." And right behind the cash register is this enormous 3-foot tall, 2-foot wide plaque honoring Harridan. And I think that it's very appropriate that it's there because it's emblematic of the way that privateering is treated in American history. It's sort of hidden away. People don't know much about it, and I'm hoping that this book changes that a bit. Now, Harridan remained in Bilbao for 2 months, resupplying, and then he headed back to Salem, and true to form, on the way back to Salem, he captured 3 more British prizes, and when he got back to Salem, the owners of the Pickering gave him this beautiful engraved silver mug or pitcher with 2 cups that also had the engraving and his initials. And this is in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum. And because this is a special night, my wife is here. She only comes, I give a lot of talks. She comes to 1 talk that I give for each book, or if we go to Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, which we are for this book, she always comes for that. And she comes to that. So she's sitting here, and the reason I mention that, Jen and I got married in the Peabody Essex Museum. We were the first wedding there back in 1995 or 4? I'm driving home alone. What was it? It was one of those years. Anyway, we were married at East India Hall. So I have a great relationship with, I have a better relationship with the Peabody Essex right now than I do with my wife. So anyway. During his tenure in the Massachusetts Navy and as a privateer, Harridan took many prizes, captured hundreds of cannons, and at least as many British prisoners. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 59 in 1803, and his obituary in the Salem Gazette lauded him as one of the most able and valiant naval commanders that the war produced. Now, the Pickering was one of nearly 2,000 privateers, the vessels during the American Revolution, and Harridan was one of probably between 20 and 30,000 privateersmen who were active during the war. Privateers were armed vessels owned and outfitted by private individuals that had government permission to attack enemy ships during times of war. That permission came in the form of a letter of marque, a formal legal document that gave the bearer the right to seize belligerent vessels and bring them back to port, have them adjudicated in a court of vice admiralty, determined whether or not they were a valid or legal prize, and then the owners got to sell the ship and the cargo, and 50% of the proceeds went to the owners of and the investors in the ship, and the other 50% went to the people who were on board the vessel and the ones who fought. Now, despite the contributions made by Harridan and many other privateersmen, many believe that privateering was a sideshow in the war. Privateering has long been given short shrift in histories of the conflict, both general histories and maritime histories. Rebels at Sea fills the void by offering a comprehensive account of privateering that demonstrates that it was critical to winning the war, and that's what actually got me interested in writing the book. American privateersmen took the maritime fight to the British and made them bleed in countless daring actions against British merchant ships and not a few warships. Privateers caused British maritime insurance rates to rise, diverted critical British resources to protecting their vessels and to attacking American privateers, added to British weariness over the war, and played a starring role in bringing France into the war on the side of the Americans, which was a critical turning point in the conflict. On the domestic front, privateering brought much-needed goods and military supplies into the new nation, provided cash infusions for the war effort, boosted coastal economies, including Newbury ports, through the building, outfitting, and manning of privateers, and bolstered America's confidence that it might actually win in its quixotic effort to beat the most powerful nation in the world. Thousands of books have approached the Revolution from virtually every direction. Rebels at Sea places privateersmen, most of whom were not particularly well known or famous, at the very center of the war effort. It demonstrates that when the United States was a tenuous idea, they stepped forward and risked their lives to help make it a reality. In fighting against the British on the seas, the Americans relied on 4 different maritime forces. There were state navies, Washington's secret navy, which only operated for about a year at the beginning of the conflict, the Continental Navy, and privateers. Of these four, privateers were the most numerous and the most effective. They captured somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 to 1,800 British prizes worth many millions of pounds. Massachusetts, of course, we're always the first in doing a lot of things. We were the first to have a privateering law. It was passed on November 1st of 1775, and the importance of the Massachusetts Privateering Act in unleashing privateering in the colonies became even clearer in hindsight. Some 40 years later, John Adams would write that the passage of the Massachusetts Act is one of the most important documents in history. The Declaration of Independence is a trifle in comparison to it. Through early 1776, perhaps a dozen Massachusetts privateers went out. Among them was the Washington, a schooner out of Newburyport, captained by Often Boardman, shown here, who is Bethany's secret boyfriend. She loves this guy. Yeah, James is he's okay with this. No beard. This picture is from the Worcester Art Museum. They don't have it on exhibit, but I was able to find it there. Anyway, he's a fascinating character, and as Bethany can tell you ad nauseum, he had a fascinating career before the Revolution and after the Revolution. But anyway, the reason I'm talking about him is the Washington was one of the first privateers to go out, and it left in late December, and it had a very dull cruise off of Newburyport and out of the Merrimack River until about January 15th. Things got a little exciting. Just a few miles from central Newburyport, there was a short chase. They saw a vessel, and this British brig, Suki, was captured by Boardman and his men without firing a shot. In this picture, it's interesting. You probably know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was really big on maritime issues. This was in his personal collection, this little painting. I was able to find that. I just thought that was neat. So the Washington brought the Suki in, and later that day, Boardman wasn't done. They saw another vessel right off the mouth of the river, tacking back and forth. The people in town surmised that they were looking for a pilot, or maybe they were looking for Boston. So Boardman got into the 3 whaleboats with 17 men and went out to offer their assistance. So he pulls up to the vessel, and the captain, now I can't, spacing on his name, the captain yells down, "Where are we? Are we near Boston? I'm looking for Boston." And Boardman, smart guy, says, "Oh yeah, Boston. You looking for a pilot? This is Boston. I could bring you in." Archibald Bowie. That's it on the Friendship. That's right, Archibald Bowie. I just write these books. I don't remember anything. You would be surprised how often this happens. I've written a number of books, and people will ask me about a book I wrote 10 years ago, and they'll say, "Can you tell me more about X, Y, and Z?" And I'll say, "I don't know anything about X, Y, and Z." And they say, "You wrote about it in your book." So that's what happens when you get older. So anyway, so Archibald Bowie welcomes Boardman onto the ship. They start talking about events in London and in the colonies. And all the while, this guy Bowie was not too smart. All the while, why would he have 17 men and 3 whaleboats? Anyway, a couple of the men come up the gangplank, and they have weapons underneath their trench coats. I don't know if you don't call them trench coats back then. Their coats, they're close. Anyway, they had weapons. So when Boardman decided that there were enough people on, the jig is up. He told Bowie, "Your ship is mine." They unveiled their weapons, and the ship was his. It came into port. Oh, I forgot to tell you, the reason the Suki was a good capture is there were 18,000 pounds of the quote-unquote best beef. And if you know anything about maritime history, any beef that was on a ship at this time was horrible. But this was the best of the worst. And there were 18,000 pounds of butter, and there were 700 gallons of claret. And in the Friendship, there were 160,000 pounds of coal, and a whole 23 wild hogs, plus a British military officer and British military papers, all of which was delivered to George Washington in Cambridge and our troops. So often Boardman, and again, the story is amazing. How many times did he go to prison during the war? 4 times? 3 times? He escaped. Just a great guy. Beth, he was what? He deserves you, yeah. He has good taste. Okay. Anyway, Anyway, New Hampshire and Rhode Island soon followed Massachusetts in the privateering vein in early 1776, passing their own statutes. At the same time, pressure was growing for the Continental Congress to make privateering a colony-wide endeavor. And they did so on March 23rd of 1776, passed the regulations a few weeks later. And in his letter to the colonies announcing the law and the regulations, John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, said, "It is necessary in conducting the warlike operations on the part of America to meet our enemy on every ground and to defend ourselves in the best manner we can against all attempts in whatever shape to deprive us of either liberty or property." Privateers were to be a major part of the colonial war effort. Now, with their capital tied up at the docks, merchant owners, jumped or leapt at the opportunity to send out privateers, because not only could they gainfully employ, hopefully, their ships, but if they came back with prizes, they would make some money selling the ships and selling the cargo. Elias Haskett Derby, he comes up so often. I've written about him a number of times, because if you're writing about the American Revolution or shortly thereafter, the China trade, he was a big player in all of that stuff. And reportedly, the first millionaire in the United States, although I think John Jacob Astor and Stephen Girard might have been right there with him. Anyway, many men invested in privateers. There was a speculative frenzy. It was like investing in Bitcoin throughout the colonies, and everybody wanted to get a piece of these privateers that might come back with some valuable prizes. Among the more illustrious speculators was George Washington. He invested appropriately enough in a privateer called the General Washington. And also Generals Knox and Nathaniel Greene, as well as Paul Revere, also invested in privateers. Now, privateer captains would usually be hired directly and offered the largest number of shares by the owner. This guy, Elias Davis Sr., if you go on that event that Bethany talked about and go to the Cape Ann Museum, if you're lucky enough, right next to the Cape Ann Museum, attached to it, is Elias Davis's house. And this picture is over the mantelpiece. And I was there a couple of months ago, and the docent wasn't around, but I told them who I was, and they said, "Who are you?" And I said, "You sell my books, they're right there." So they gave me a nice tour. So I got to see this. But he was the last person in the United States, or in the colonies, whatever you want to call them, that got a letter of marque in 1783. And he went on to become quite famous or successful after the war. But my daughter, Lily, who is now a literary agent, she was promoted, she's a literary agent in New York City, but she doesn't like nonfiction, she likes fiction. Anyway, she was home at the time because it was COVID, and I found this picture, and I said, "Lily, come here, take a look at this." And she took a good long look at this, and she said, "I could really get into privateering." Because he's really cute. I thought so. When I saw him first, I said, "Wow." Anyway, I don't know if it helped him as a privateersman. Anyway, while crewmen were sometimes known to the owners prior to being hired, in most cases they weren't. And the way that they got privateersmen was they put in the local newspaper ads like this. And they'd invite them to what was called a hearty welcome. Basically, if you know anything about American colonial history, everybody was soused. Everybody was drinking. James, you would have had a great time back then, serving them. And so I have in the book a record of one of these events. The numbers of bowls of punch and cherry toddies and rum that was served was amazing. And then they would get them to sign on to the Articles of Agreement, and they would go out on a cruise. Now, black men served on many privateers, and some were freemen. One of those was this guy, James Fortin, who his grandfather actually purchased his freedom, and his parents were free, and they were in Philadelphia for a small group of freed black people in Philadelphia. Now, he signed on to the Royal Lewis, a privateer out of Philadelphia, captained by Stephen Decatur, the father of the much more famous Stephen Decatur later on in the Quasi-War and Barbary War and the War of 1812. Anyway, why did this guy, because you know that the English offered slaves in particular, enslaved people, the opportunity to defect and get their freedom, supposedly. So black people were not treated well at all in the colonies, of course. So why would one like James Forten decide to throw his weight and his might behind the American cause? And there are two reasons. One is when he was 10 years old, the Declaration of Independence was read in a square in Philadelphia on July 8th, and he reportedly was there. And he heard the soaring rhetoric about men being created equal, and he believed the words, or at least he hoped they might be true. And then 4 years later, in 1780, Pennsylvania became the first of the American states, or the first to pass a gradual abolition of slavery law. Now, it was very gradual. Current enslaved individuals were not freed. Their children would be freed when they turned 28. But it was something. And these two laws convinced Forten that he wanted to be on the American side of this battle. So he goes out in the Royal Lewis, comes back, they capture 7 prizes. He's happy, he gives money to his mother. He decides to go out again on the Royal Lewis. Well, bad decision, because just a day out of port, the HMS Amphion, Captain John Bazley, captures the Royal Lewis. And Forten at this point is incredibly scared, because he knows that people, as he wrote, of his complexion who were captured by the British would tend to be sent to the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands, and sold into slavery. And that's what he thought his fate was going to be. Fortunately for him, Captain Bazley had a 12-year-old son on board who needed a companion. And for some reason, he chose Forten. And Forten hung out with his son for 4 or 5 weeks before they pulled into New York, which was under British control. And Bazley was so impressed by Forten and how he was deferential to his son and played marbles so well and was a good companion, he offered Forten a choice. He said, you can either go to England, you'll be my son's ward essentially, you'll have your freedom, you'll have money, I'll educate you, and you'll have all the good things in life. Or I will give you over to the prisons in New York City, along with everybody else on the Royal Lewis, and you'll have a miserable time. Make your choice. Well, James Forten said, I'm a patriot. Sorry, I'm not going to take your silk parachute, or whatever you want to call it. And he went to the Jersey, which was, as I'll talk about later, the worst of the prison ships. And he lasted 8 years. But this guy Bazley had some honor, because he talked to David Sproat, the head of the prisons in New York, and he basically said, James Forten's a good kid. Try to treat him well and allow him to be exchanged in a prisoner exchange. And he was exchanged. There were very few prisoner exchanges. He was exchanged 8 months later. And he went back to Philadelphia. He became the leading sailmaker in Philadelphia. When he died, he was worth $70,000, which was a lot of money in the early 1840s. He also stuck true to his belief that America would live up to its ideals, and he was one of the first people to give seed money to William Lloyd Garrison to launch the Liberator. So a really interesting guy. Anyway, other black men were enslaved individuals who ran away, and they thought they gained their freedom by going on a privateer. Then there were many owners who saw a business opportunity and rented out their enslaved individuals. That was also done on whaling voyages, by the way. But anyway, this painting was at one point thought to be the only known painting of a black American privateersman. And it was owned by a urologist in Rhode Island. And it was valued at $300,000 because it was unique. And it was used in many books, including a really great book called Blackjacks by, I'm totally spacing on his name, a historian. Anyway, to depict black men during Jeffrey Bolster, to depict black men during the Revolution. And it was in the centerpiece of a number of exhibitions. Well, Fraunces Tavern, which is in New York City, and where I'm supposedly speaking in the fall, arranging things now, they wanted to have an exhibition on black men and women in the American Revolution. And this was to be the centerpiece of their exhibition. So the urologist sent it out to an art conservator to get it fixed up. The art conservator took a little bit of solvent, rubbed the hand, and the black paint came off, and there was a white hand underneath. Turns out sometime in the middle of the 20th century, somebody realizing that a black privateersman would be much more valuable than a white Mariner during the same time, because it was dated to the American Revolution, painted it. And Francis Tavern, of course, found out about this and was told about this, so it was no longer in the exhibition. And that $300,000 painting is now worth $3,000, and it's hanging in the living room of a friend of mine whose dad was the urologist. So anyway, very interesting, but okay. And then there were those black men who were treated as transient property. One thing that, and this friend of mine actually has a book coming out at the end of the month all about how privateers really affected the slave trade during the American Revolution. They did, because when privateers captured British slavers, which they captured many of them off the west coast of Africa, they became slave traders. They didn't just release those black slaves. They took them to the slave marts in the colonies or in the Caribbean and made some money. So they became slave traders as well. And I'm ashamed to admit, John Brown, I went to Brown undergraduate. Brown, like a lot of other schools, has really come to grips lately with their slave-owning past. And there's a wonderful sculpture right near Manning Chapel at Brown of these huge iron chains. You know, so there's been a lot of good literature, a lot of good scholarship lately, not just Brown, but Harvard, Yale, and a lot of other schools. Because now I'm going to tell you my cynical side. The more I read about American history, and you have to keep in mind, I went to an undergraduate, master's, and a PhD in environmental policy and biology. I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau when I grew up. I sort of fell into history, and I love history, and I'm not a trained historian, so I'm always learning. And the more I read about history, the more cynical I get about human nature. And our history is so full of so many horrible passages. It really, some days it's hard to work on it. Anyway, that's my editorializing about history. There's good history too. There's a lot of good history, a lot of good people. Anyway, many have argued that privateers were motivated by greed alone. Famed naval officer John Paul Jones, interesting character, who I think's reputation is much grander than he deserves, anyway, believed that it was nothing but greed. Early on in the war, he complained that the common principle, the common class of mankind, are actuated by no nobler principle than that of self-interest. This and this alone determines all adventures in privateers. A less cynical assessment views privateersmen as being motivated by a combination of greed and or profits and patriotism. And I think that is closer to the truth. Now, part of the reason privateering was scorned, that many believed that the practice undermined the Republican ideals of the Revolution, which called for the sacrifice of private interests in the service of the public good. According to Mercy Otis Warren, shown here, the author of one of the earliest histories of the Revolution, privateering had a tendency to contract the mind and led it to shrink into selfish views and indulgencies, totally inconsistent with genuine republicanism. Many of the founding fathers and mothers agreed in principle. But in practice, however, many elites had a more complex view of patriotism, one that wasn't based on hewing to Republican ideals above all else. The majority of delegates to Congress clearly believed that privateering was a patriotic endeavor that served the public good. They made it a major part of America's war strategy, fully aware that it was making many individuals, including many of them, rich. Had Congress deemed that privateering worked against the public good, they could have squashed it. They could have ended privateering, but they never considered that option. And that's because the delegates and many other political and civic leaders didn't view patriotism and the pursuit of profit as mutually exclusive. Now, the argument that privateers were only in it for the money implies that others involved in the revolution were not. That's baloney. While the men who rose up after the Battle of Bunker Hill were brimming with patriotic fervor, it was very difficult to retain that fire throughout the course of the American Revolution. The only way that Congress could keep some semblance of a fighting force was to use cash bonuses and the promise of land, and those promises often were not fulfilled, unfortunately, to induce men to serve. The Navy was no different. The mariners who joined Washington's Navy, as well as those who signed up for state navies and the Continental Navy, were all motivated in part by money. Each of the naval services offered officers and crew a cut of the profits in addition to their base salaries because few would have joined otherwise. This broadside, put together by John Paul Jones and posted all around Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to get people to join on the naval ship Ranger, could have just as easily been a recruiting poster for privateers, because there's a sentence in it that it gives people who sign on an opportunity to distinguish themselves in the glorious cause of their country and make their fortunes. I mean, the whole war was about money. I mean, the navigation acts, the dumping of tea, anyway. American history, I'm fond of saying that if you want to understand why things happen, follow the money. And I really think that's true in particular in American history. Whose ox is gored, who's making money, who's not. And it's so strange that people want to idealize our founding fathers as being pure Republicans when they were just like the rest of us. Anyway, George Washington, that paragon of Republican virtue, he understood the mixed motivations of men all too well. In 1778, he wrote, "Men may speculate as they will. They may talk of patriotism, but whoever builds upon it as a sufficient basis for conducting a long and bloody war will find themselves deceived in the end. A great and lasting war can never be supported on this principle alone. It must be aided by a prospect of interest or some reward." And I have to add, since George is up here, I have a short part of the book which talks about George Washington's dentist who made him those horrible teeth, who was also a privateersman. And my editor, when he read that section, he said, "You ought to cut this out." And I said, "Absolutely not. I paid the Mount Vernon Ladies Association $200 to use a picture of his dentures, and that thing is staying in the book." And I have gotten more comments on that section than almost any other section of the book. So don't listen to editors, anyway. Now, who knows how many privateer owners and privateersmen were moved by patriotic impulses, but it clearly, in my mind, was in line with levels of patriotism that were prevalent in society at large. As privateersman and soldier, Christopher Prince said, looking back on his revolutionary career, "Through the whole course of the war, I have had two motives in view. One was the freedom of my country, and the other was the luxuries of life." Now, privateers experienced many triumphs and tragedies. The Pennsylvania brig Holker, which is not this is the Fair American, but Holker looked like this a little bit bigger, brought in 71 prizes over 4 years with 11 captains. In one cruise, it captured 10 prizes that were sold in port for £2 million. Here's one of your own. Everybody know who this guy is. Nathaniel Tracy, Newbury port merchant Nathaniel Tracy was the principal owner in 47 privateers, which captured 120 British ships, the cargoes of which sold for nearly $4 million. He also contributed $167,000 to the Army and public purposes. Now, the one thing I don't talk about in the book, because it sort of goes against my argument of a lot of people getting rich, is for some reason this guy made all that money. He was poverty-stricken not long after the war. I don't know exactly what happened, but he was a bad manager of money maybe, or just fell on bad times. Now, one of the worst tragedies to befall privateers was something called the Penobscot Expedition. I had never heard about this. And I want to add that every single book I've written, with the exception of one, are on topics I know nothing about, or almost nothing about, before I start writing it. So all of these things I'm telling you about, when I was working on the book, it was like discovery after discovery. I'd never heard of the Penobscot Expedition, but it's a fascinating failure. It was the largest maritime force gathered during the war. There was 19 warships, most of them from Massachusetts, and 12 of them were privateers. Their mission was to dislodge British forces that were building a fort on a peninsula in Maine's Penobscot Bay, where present-day Castine is. The expedition sailed from Boston on July 19, 1779. Poor organization and leadership and a critical delay in launching the attack, which was largely the result of one of the leaders' total lack of conviction, led to a fiasco when on August 14th, the Royal Navy finally had been alerted. They showed up at the mouth of Penobscot Bay, and it included a 64-gun warship. And it was a complete rout. In the end, 16 American ships were burned by their own men to keep them from being captured by the British. And since they were primed for battle, when these things burned, all the cannons exploded. It was like the 4th of July. And the rest of the ships were captured or sunk. As for the men, the soldiers and sailors alike bolted into the woods and desperately tried to make their way back to New Hampshire and Massachusetts before starving. Now, how many Americans died during the siege of Penobscot is a point of debate. The lowest number I found was 33. The highest number was more than 500. And many have labeled it as the most devastating maritime or naval defeat that the United States has suffered up until December 7th, 1941, during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the British Lion roared in pain as a result of privateering attacks. They forced the British to divert naval forces to protect merchant ships and convoys, and also to attack American ships. Britain also issued their own letters of marque. Even though they called American privateers pirates, they relied on the very same tactic as they had for hundreds of years, and they unleashed a miniature fleet of privateers searching for American prey. And aggrieved British merchants pressured politicians to do something, anything, to get us back to trading with the Americans, even if they're not part of our country. We want to make money. Now, one of the most important things that privateers did during the Revolution was to bring France into the war on the side of America. In the early years of the war, France allowed American privateers in the Caribbean and in France to use their ports, reprovision, sell prizes, bring on men. All of this was in violation of treaties between France and Britain. And that, plus the damage done by American privateers, infuriated the British. The Continental Congress sent William Bingham to the French colony of Martinique, where one of his main tasks was to encourage American privateering and get the French to allow American privateers to come into port. By the time he got there, right after the Declaration of Independence, France had already decided to let American privateers in. And his efforts to add to America's privateering laurels worked brilliantly. In 1777, British sources estimated that American privateers and naval ships operating in the Caribbean had cost British merchants 1.8 million pounds. A year later, it was estimated that privateers had captured 250 British ships, and trade to the sugar colonies had plummeted by 66%. And bear in mind that trade between Britain and its sugar colonies was way more important than any trade it had ever had with the American colonies. So alarming were these figures that the Earl of Suffolk urged Parliament to keep them from the public, pointing out the impropriety of acknowledging what ought not to be acknowledged at so critical a period, the weakness of the nation. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, who was in France, trying to get France to join us in this war through a formal alliance, was convinced that privateering was helping the American cause with the French, while at the same time injuring Britain. That which makes the greatest impression in our favor here, Franklin wrote, is the prodigious success of our armed ships and privateers. He added that England is extremely exasperated by the favor of our armed vessels, have met with here. And look at this picture. I mean, it is so mind-blowing to me to think that this is only, 200 to 300 years ago, and even more recently than that. We had kings and queens, Queen Elizabeth today. Still dressing like this, the pomp and circumstance, and just the context of this war is just fascinating to me. Now, London's public advertiser asserted that if France continued to allow American privateers to use its ports, an immediate war between France and Britain will be the inevitable consequence. Now, the critical turning point in getting France to ally with the Americans was the American victory over Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne at Saratoga in October of 1777. Privateering, while not causing a sharp turn in American fortunes on its own, helped create the situation in which this great American victory could prove decisive in bringing France into the conflict. It did so by greatly increasing the enmity between the French and the British, and also inflicting serious damage to the British economy. And as I said, I just went on a trip with my son to the Saratoga battle site. I missed Benedict Arnold's leg. We didn't go see that, but we got to see the area where the battle took place, and it was just fascinating. Now, arguably the most horrific chapter in the war, bar none, concerns the prisons in England and the prison ships in the colonies, particularly New York. In both places, American privateersmen made up the bulk of the prison population. The two main prisons in Britain were Mill and Fortin prison. They only had about 3,000 prisoners during the entire course of the war, and the death rate was about 3 to 6%, which is sort of on par with other prisons during this era. Now, Mill and Fortin prisons were not easy places to be, and they were bad enough, but by far the worst experience any combatant had to endure was a stay on one of the British prison ships moored off of New York City in Wallabout Bay, which is right on the edge where the Brooklyn Navy Yard is today. Between 15,000 and 22,000 men were held on these ships. All of the prison ships were dreadful, but by far the worst was the Jersey, which was labeled by the men who stayed there, Hell Afloat. It was a fourth-rate 64-gun British warship that had been dismasted, brought into Wallabout Bay, basically wedged into the mud, and during low tide there was only 4 or 5 feet of water on the side of the ship, and basically right over here is land. So the men, the prisoners on the ship, could actually see, farms and a nicer life while they were imprisoned. And the Jersey held, believe it or not, look at that thing, the Jersey held between 800 and 1,200 men on any single day for multiple years. Between 6 and 12 men died every day. Every morning, the British came to the head of the stairs and yelled down, "Rebels, bring up your dead." Those dead were put into whaleboats or longboats, taken to the shore very close by, interred in shallow graves. Whenever there was a storm or a particularly high tide, all of a sudden those graves, the dirt would be washed away, and the men on board, who were allowed to come up to the main deck for about an hour a day, could actually see this grisly rack line of death just not far away from them, which was, for unfortunately most of them, because about 90% of the people on these ships ultimately died. So one other thing I wanted to tell, well, I'll tell you after I read this. This is an account of somebody who was on the ship. He left this damning portrait. There were about 1,100 prisoners on board. There were no berths or seats to lie down on, not a bench to sit on. Many were almost without clothes. The dysentery, fever, frenzy, and despair prevailed among them and filled the place with filth, disgust, and horror. The scantiness of the allowance, the bad quality of the provisions, the brutality of the guards, and the sick pining for comforts they could not obtain, altogether furnished continually one of the greatest scenes of human distress and misery ever beheld. And just to give you another example, a couple of examples, it was a hard chapter to write. At the base of the stairs, during the night, the men had to go to the bathroom. They tried to make it to the base of the stairs to relieve themselves. They often didn't make it. And every morning, I know this could gross you out, luckily you probably already ate dinner. Every morning there was 2 to 3 feet of feces surrounding the stairs. And think about how they made the meat. On top, they had these big copper cauldrons. What they would do is they would take the already rotten meat, throw it into the copper cauldrons. They'd use a hose to bring up salt water from the side of the ship, the very place where they threw all the offal and waste from the ship itself. They took that polluted water, put it into the copper pot, heated it up. So not only were the men eating rotten meat that was boiled in rotten water, but the salt water reacted with the copper, so they were being dosed with heavy metals at the same time. It just was a horrible, horrible experience. If you know anything about the Civil War, it's sort of like the shocking things that happened at Andersonville prison. Anyway, the number of deaths on the Jersey alone is shocking. The best estimate points to it being about 11,500 men, most of them privateersmen. By comparison, in the entire war, somewhere between 4,400 and 6,800 Americans died in the direct line of battle. And if you ever go to New York, I wish I could remember which island it's on because I haven't visited it yet, but there is a monument to these people who died on the Jersey and other ships. It looks sort of like a Washington monument, and they actually have a crypt at the base of it with a number of the bones from the men who couldn't be identified, but so they're there. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of privateers is that they siphoned valuable manpower from the Continental Navy, and that is absolutely true. A lot of men decided to join privateers instead of going on a naval vessel because there was a possibility of greater profits and there was less discipline and shorter cruises. Now, that doesn't mean that had there been no privateers that suddenly the Continental Navy would have been turned into a fearsome fighting machine. There were roughly 60 Continental Navy warships during the entire war operating in the Atlantic. Building and assembling a navy from scratch would be a gargantuan task for a well-functioning, well-funded government. The Continental Congress was anything but. If you know the 13 colonies, they were like 13 individual countries. There was no opportunity to levy taxes. So the Continental Congress faced an almost insurmountable challenge in pulling together this navy fast. The cost of fielding the Navy was between $12 and $13 million, or 16% of all the expenditures of Congress throughout the entire war. Because Congress didn't have the power to levy taxes, the Navy came to life haltingly. And because some of these frigates, some of them were actually built, they were built so quickly they used green wood. Well, what happens if you have green wood in your hull? Well, as it dry, you have leaks. It was just a mess. So the Continental Navy's record in battle is not an enviable one. 28 vessels were captured or destroyed, and many others were lost at sea, sold, or returned to France, or burned, once again, to keep them from falling into British hands. At war's end, just a few Navy ships were left. There were, however, some bright spots for the Navy. Raids on the Caribbean munitions depots brought back much-needed gunpowder. Navy ships did an excellent job of ferrying diplomats and correspondents back and forth across the Atlantic, and they captured about 200 prizes, most of which, just like privateers, were merchant ships, not Navy ships. Now, nevertheless, in July 1780, John Adams, who was a big fan of the Continental Navy and of privateering, reflected on the fortunes of the Navy, writing, "In looking over the long list of vessels belonging to the United States taken and destroyed, and recollecting the whole history of the rise and progress of our Navy, it is very difficult to avoid tears. The American Revolution was the Navy's first hour, but not its finest." And I actually said that sentence a week ago at the United States Naval Museum in Washington, D.C., with the director of the museum sitting right in front of me, and he agreed with me. So they didn't put me in the stocks. Now, it's difficult to imagine a different record for the Navy if privateering had been outlawed. If there had been no privateers, the Navy would have had an easier time recruiting officers and men. It would have had more ammunition. It would have had more cannons. But the absence of privateers would not have meant a larger and significantly more effective Navy. Congress would not have suddenly come up with more money to develop a bigger fighting force. Indeed, given the great strain Congress was under in funding a Navy of roughly 60 ships, it is virtually impossible to see how America could have fielded a larger Navy even if it had wanted to. And it is this light that the value of privateering becomes most evident. While many would have preferred that Americans send forth a powerful Navy, that was not possible under the circumstances. In the absence of such a force, America relied heavily on privateers. Under the circumstances, that was the best strategy available, no matter what the critics said. We're almost done. On the home front, privateers contributed materially to the American economy. Shipyards hummed with activity, and merchants were kept busy outfitting privateers. Privateering was a great economic boon for coastal cities and towns, keeping many businesses afloat during the war and creating new ones as well as new fortunes. And the money that privateersmen earned helped them provide for their families and thereby gave an additional jolt to the local economies. And although I don't like engaging in hypotheticals, what ifs, just like I don't like looking back at history and assuming that everything that happened was inevitable, far from that, I do want you to think for a second, if there hadn't been privateering, if all those thousands of people in Newburyport, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in other places up and down the coast, didn't have a way of trying to earn a living, if all the money that came into these ports from privateering was not there. Do you think the ports, which were the center of political power in the colonies, would have hung on that long to support this war against the British, which for many years in the beginning, in particular when privateers were most important, was going horribly? I think it's a good question. I don't think so. Now anyway, goods brought in by privateers were central to privateering's economic impact as well. With regular trades of Channel cut off, the American states suffered from shortages. Each prize auction delivered a new stream of commodities. Now sometimes you got too many potatoes or too many hogs. You never got too much rum, but it was sort of uneven, but it still helped the Americans. And in August of 1779, a thankful Pennsylvanian told Congress that privateers have rendered us the most essential services and brought us many articles for public and private use, without which the war could hardly have been supported. Privateering also had a psychological impact. There were 30 newspapers in the colonies at this time. There were thousands of articles on privateering. A lot of them were negative, but I think more were positive. And what that did is it gave people some confidence, especially in the early years when so much was going wrong, some confidence, some glimmer of hope that we might actually prevail. Now, the formal end of the war came on September 3rd, 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed. Surviving privateers that had been merchantmen before the war now reverted to form, while those vessels built for privateering were refitted as merchantmen. These ships now played their part in transporting American wares to distant ports, proudly flying the new nation's flag. The men who owned and financed privateers, as well as those who had chosen to fight for their country on the decks of these vessels, looked back on their accomplishments with pride and wondered, as did all Americans, what the future would bring for themselves and their new country. And just to end, my argument is not that privateering was the most important reason why we won. There is no single important reason, not even George Washington's leadership. If you look at the American Revolution and you're honest with yourself, you will see that at numerous times, inflection points, if troops had shown up a day later, a day earlier, if one different decision had been made, the war might have ended differently. And I happen to believe very strongly that if the British hadn't been so arrogant at the outset of the war and viewed us as just a rabble in arms, they would have made quick work of the colonies within the first year or two. They really lost their best chance. And then when France came in, it became a world war. So my argument is that privateering is one of many factors, because as George Washington said, it was a standing miracle that we won. And there were many things that contributed to that miracle. And I'm very happy that we did win, because if we didn't, I wouldn't be here today. So anyway, that's my talk. Thanks. So I'll answer any questions, and I have to say I did bring books to sell and sign. I'll sign them however you want. One of the funniest things I signed was a guy came up to me for my pirate book, I think, and he said, I want you to write, "Without you, I couldn't have written this book." so I did. Anyway, I did. Oh yeah, I wrote it. Yeah, I write. Well, my wife's here. I'll tell an even saucier story. I was at the Stanford Yacht Club. I spent my high school years in Stanford, but I had never been in the yacht club. My family was not yacht club people. And anyway, I was invited to speak at the Stanford Yacht Club a couple of times. And one time I was there, and this woman afterwards comes up. She's laughing, and she's with her, I assume, her boyfriend. She's got a copy of my book, and she goes, "I know just what I want you to write." And I said, "Okay." She goes, "I want you to write, dear," I don't remember her name, "Dear, I love you so much. You mean so much to me. Love, Erica." And there was a bookseller next to me, and I looked at her. I said, "Should I write that?" And she goes, "I don't know. It's your book." And I said, "It's a sale." So I wrote it, but Jennifer was not very excited when I told her that story. I have no idea. Somewhere there's a book that says, "I love this woman." So anyway. It's too late. It's too late. It's not the worst thing I've done in my life. So
Any questions or, yeah? Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Would it be fair to characterize privateering as kind of a form of outsourcing, like what's happening with NASA and Jeff Bezos and
That's interesting. I don't view it quite like that. I mean, you can. A lot of people, there's a big section of my book where people view privateering as legalized piracy. And I argue that it's not during the Revolution. And the reason it is because privateering in the 1600s, 1500s, and early 1700s was very often just piracy. They just had letters of marque, and they were going out and they were attacking ships that were their country was not at war with. So privateering had a bad name, and that's why a lot of people reflexively think of it as piracy. But you raise an interesting question. It is like outsourcing, and there actually have been recent efforts, because in the United States Constitution, Section 1, Article 8, allows for letters of marque to be issued to this day. We were not one of the countries that signed a treaty in 1856, that outlawed privateering because we wanted to have it in our back pocket. It bit some of us in the behind, because what happened during the Civil War? Jefferson Davis issued letters of marque for Southern privateers to attack Union shipping. And in fact, they captured a couple of Union ships, but then the Union ships captured some Confederate privateers, and one of the first privateers captured was the Savannah. And the men on board the Savannah were brought to New York City. They were put in manacles. They were paraded down Broadway. They were jeered at. Things were thrown at them. They were thrown into the Tombs prison. And then Abraham Lincoln said he was going to hang them for piracy. He didn't remember his own history. You know, for piracy. Well, Jefferson Davis said, Abe, he didn't really say that. He wrote a letter. You do that, and I'm going to start hanging your soldiers one for one. So needless to say, the Union did not hang Confederate privateersmen. And after about a year and a half, they stopped issuing letters of marque because they weren't that effective. The Alabama and Shenandoah, the more formal Southern Navy, was more effective. And actually, the Union thought about issuing letters of marque. But to get to your question, there was a bill introduced just a couple of months ago to resuscitate privateering, because there's a big argument in certain sectors of the military community that we should use privateers, sort of like Blackwater almost. We should use privateers to attack terrorists, or maybe to protect against Somali pirates. Or some people have even recommended using American privateers to attack Chinese merchant shipping, because they're our enemies. Now, I did not talk about that in the book. I have a footnote. Time magazine asked me to write, well, I've written essays for Time magazine before, and the editor was interested in having me do something on privateering. And she said, can you connect it to Blackwater? Can you connect it to modern day? Is there any parallels, or do you want to talk about that law? And I like writing about things when everybody's dead, because I have very strong political views, but I certainly don't want to get into an argument with people who are gung-ho about resuscitating privateering. So I declined, so I didn't write that essay. But yes, there are parallels, I suppose. I don't think it's a good idea to resuscitate privateering, mainly because we have a very effective, efficient, and powerful Navy that can be brought to bear if necessary. So anyway, that's that question. Did you have a question?
Anyway, I was just going to ask whether it was a bolder line or more blended line between piracy and privateering.
Well,
Touched on that, but
well, piracy were men that were not fighting for any in particular country, despite what some books say. Blackbeard and the Pirates of the Caribbean and even the pirates earlier, they were not fighting on behalf of some Jacobite revolution in England. They were fighting for themselves. And some people saying that pirates were Robin Hood's men, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. The only poor they wanted to give to was themselves. So they had no allegiance to a larger cause other than themselves. And they were vicious, and they attacked ships of all nations, enemy of all mankind. Privateering during the American Revolution is different because they were fighting for a cause. Yes, they were using the same skills that pirates used to attack ships. But if you use that argument, the Continental Navy were a bunch of pirates, because the Continental Navy acted during the American Revolution almost exactly as American privateers did. Continental Navy was never intended to go up against British warships. They couldn't handle a 64-gun warship or even a 44-gun frigate. They went out, and they specifically, John Paul Jones included, minus the Serapis, which was a Pyrrhic victory, if anything, they went out after merchant ships. So I do not believe that privateers during the American Revolution were pirates. I can see why some people would say that. And if you look at our own history and you read a really great book, Black Flags, Blue Waters, I've got a big section in it during King William's War at the end of the 1600s. The American colonies issued a bunch of letters of marque because England was at war with France. England issued letters of marque to attack French shipping. In the colonies, in New York, in Rhode Island, other places, North Carolina, the colonial governors issued letters of marque. They extracted 300 pounds per letter of marque. So it was a form of extortion almost. They gave these letters of marque to American vessels with American men on board. They were supposed to go out and attack French ships. What did they do? They got in their vessels with their legitimate letter of marque. They sailed around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, where they attacked Mughal ships transiting between India and the Red Sea ports of Jeddah and Mocha, mainly during the Hajj, with lots of money on board, lots of Far Eastern goods, engaged in vile activities, killed a lot of people, brought all that booty back to the colonies where they were welcomed with open arms, despite the fact that England had outlawed piracy and was upset about this activity in the colonies. And not only that, when the pirates came back, each individual pirate or privateer was forced to grease the hands of local officials, mainly the colonial governor, with 100 pieces of 8, just to be allowed to come back into port and not be arrested for the very illegal act that they had been sent out to do in the first place. I mean, you know, American history, any history, is full of hypocrisy. And once again, you have to ask where the money's going. And Americans love these guys. They were their fathers, sons, and brothers who went halfway around the world to attack quote-unquote infidels because they were non-Christian and they didn't care about them, and bring that money back to America, which had been treated horribly by the mother country, who starved them of currency. So these pirates brought back currency. And America, the colonies, always got the worst goods. All the best Far Eastern goods went to London first and was sold in England, and then it went to the Caribbean, where all the rich sugar barons were, and then finally the dregs went to the American colonies. We were used in the mercantile theory of the day. You know, American colonies were just a source of raw materials for the mother country, by and large, and they had a very negative view of us. So there's a lot of reasons why there's a revolution. It wasn't just the tea, the Boston Massacre. Anyway, it's a long, get me going. See, the problem is I work in my garage. My garage is a converted office, very nice office. I used to work in the basement, but my wife decided I'm too much of an introvert. I needed some light. So we redid the garage, which is my favorite room in the house. But you can see what happens. I spend a lot of time alone. When I'm in front of people, I can't shut up. Another question?
I thought a percentage of the take from each merchant ship by a privateer had to go to the continental government. Is that
Nope.
true?
That's not true. A percentage of the take of any naval, continental Navy ship, of roughly a half or a third, depending on the type of ship they attacked, went to the Continental Congress. The rest of it was split between the men on board, the Marines or the sailors. But the reason that privateers offered an opportunity to make more money is because Navy ships had to protect ports. They couldn't just go where the prey was. They had diplomatic dispatches. There was more rigorous discipline. Privateers went on shorter, quicker cruises. They could accumulate more prizes. They were much more focused on the profit side of it than the Continental Navy was. But the Continental Navy, the men that were on those ships, they made money. I mean, the British Navy, the Lords of the Ocean, the British Navy, they even gave their mariners and their sailors more money than our Continental Navy did. During there are numerous cases in American colonial history where you had British naval ships coming to protect our ports. And while they were there, they engaged in graft and corruption and kickbacks because a lot of the captains of these naval ships viewed it as a, what's that word that people use all the time? I forget. Sinecure, right? And they viewed it as their little domain. and they were able to, sometimes they actually extorted people, but they made money. It was a way to make money and also advance yourself within society. I'm not saying everything is about money. I mean, as I say in the book, people had real patriotic motives. I do believe that. But if you take money totally out of the equation, there are very few people who are so pure of heart that they're willing to put their lives on the line just for a principle, I think. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'll take both of you. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about the rules for the American Navy when they took a ship? I know the British Navy at the time, when a captain took a ship, the captain got a portion of the profits.
Yes.
And sold the ship just as the privateer.
Yeah.
Was there a similar rule for the American Navy?
Yeah, when an American naval ship brought in a prize, it would go to the Court of Vice Admiralty in the same sort of manner, whether it was a valid prize, because you can only bring in British ships or neutral ships that were carrying ammunition or war materials to the British Navy or the British Army. You couldn't just go out and attack a friendly ship or a neutral ship that was carrying stuff between Holland and, I don't know, some South American country. So there'd be a judgment. And so if it was a valid prize, they would get, Continental Congress would get some, the captain would get a bigger share than the men who were beneath him, but they would all split about roughly half of the money, sort of like privateers.
To follow up question.
Yeah.
Suppose you made a mistake and captured an enemy neutral. Could you be screwed like
Yeah.
the British captains were?
Yeah, well, you were screwed in the sense that there were a number of court cases that got appealed to a higher courts where somebody was able to prove that that ship that was captured was not a valid prize, and the court ruled that the ship and its cargo had to be returned to the owners. So there were ships that were captured by privateers and by naval ships that were mistakes, in effect, and they got returned to Holland or Germany or even France and or Spain. So yes, mistakes were made. I don't think there was any official punishment that the captain got other than losing their payday. So yeah.
The privateering that the subject of your speech was the period from it, roughly, approximately, what year to what year? How long a life did it?
Well, basically the whole course of the American Revolution. It was 1775 to the last letters of marque were issued in 1783. The war was in effect almost over. In fact, there were some privateers from Salem that were out, and the letters of marque were rescinded on a certain date. And they were, the English ship that they captured knew that the war was over, but the American ship had been out for a number of months, didn't know that the war was officially over, captured this very valuable ship, brought it into Salem, and even though it captured it a couple of weeks after the date that the Continental Congress set for the sunsetting of all letters of marque, the court in Salem ruled it was a valid prize, and Elias Haskett Derby got a very valuable payday because it was a very big ship, the Pompey, and unfortunately the captain, the British, lost out. So, okay, thanks again. Oh, thank you.